Jeffrey M. Hovenier served as Deputy Director of German, Austrian, and Swiss Affairs from 2002 to 2004. Prior to that, he served in Vienna, Austria as the Deputy Political Counselor at the U.S. Mission for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe from 1998 to 2002. He was responsible for the Balkans and was the U.S. lead negotiator for the 2001 OSCE Bucharest Ministerial Document Package and the Agreement on Stability under the Dayton Article 5, and represented the U.S. in the OSCE's Political Military Forum, the Forum on Security Cooperation. Hovenier helped reopen Embassy Belgrade in December 2000, following reestablishment of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Yugoslavia, and later headed a temporary embassy office in southern Serbia to manage the ethnic Albanian insurgency in the Presovo Valley. From February to April 2002, he headed the embassy office, now consulate, in Podgorica?
Now embassy.
Oh, embassy, correct. Montenegro during the EU's negotiations to address the issues of Montenegrin independence. He's also served in Zagreb, Croatia, Asunción, Paraguay, and Panama City, Panama. He received a BA from BYU and a master's degree from Georgetown University. He's fluent in Spanish, Croatian, and German. He's also married and the father of 4 children. As I mentioned, we're very pleased under these circumstances to welcome back Mr. Jeff Hovenier. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good afternoon. It is a real honor for me to be here today. And I want to thank the Kennedy Center and Corey Leonard in particular for this opportunity to be here and to participate in this Global Awareness Lecture Series. It's my second opportunity. I hope it's not my last, because this is a lot of fun. Before I turn to the advertised topic and talk about my experiences of the last year or so, well, we'll talk about more than that, but with particular focus on the last year or so working on the Kosovo status talks and where that's headed, I hope you'll indulge me for just a minute to put in another plug for the Kennedy Center. Most of you know this, but I consider myself a product of and a creature of this institution. My undergraduate degree was from the Kennedy Center. Back then, the IR degree was from the Kennedy Center. I think I'm one of the very few speakers in this global lecture series who was actually present at the ceremonies creating the Kennedy Center. It was the fall of 1983. I remember President Holland. I was a freshman here at BYU, and I knew that international relations was something I was interested in, and I went to the ceremonies because we were able to. Any student who wanted to go could go into the Wilkinson Center and watch the dedication. It was over there, not here. They did stuff here, too. My preparation here, I went on to a fairly competitive graduate program at Georgetown University, and I have to tell you who are undergrads, I felt every bit as prepared as anybody I was competing with as a doctoral candidate at Georgetown University in political science, if not more so. And my first real job, beyond the confines of a swimming pool or a retail cash register, was in this building. Spencer Palmer, one of the early leaders at the Kennedy Center, hired me to be a teaching assistant and a research assistant, and my office was around the corner that way, about where the area studies offices are now. And finally, and perhaps not most importantly for you, but for me, the first real I'd met her before, but the first real conversation I ever had with the woman I eventually married was right out there in that hallway, right in that entryway. I was over here doing something, looking and studying abroad or something, and she saw me because she was in my ward and walked up and initiated a conversation. If you knew her, she's somewhat shy, and it was rare for her to approach people. And I remember thinking, wow, this girl's kind of interesting. Anyway, it's a long story. But so for me, this is, I hate to say hallowed ground, but pretty special ground. I just want to say that coming in. I hope you do appreciate just what a unique institution the Kennedy Center is for you, and I hope you are taking full advantage of all that it offers because it is an amazing resource. All right. When I was invited to come speak here last fall, I had anticipated that right now, kind of the end of January, would be the perfect time for me to come and brief you all on the outcome of the Kosovo status talks, a process that I had the pleasure of participating in as a U.S. negotiator in the first half of this year. The United States and a lot of our partners had set a goal publicly of trying to complete the process of determining Kosovo's status by the end of 2006. For reasons which I'll go into here in a minute in the speech, our timetable didn't materialize. And the negotiations remain ongoing, and in fact, they're going to be hitting an absolute crucial moment in the next week or two or three. And last weekend's elections, I don't know how many of you were following the parliamentary elections in Serbia with the amount of attention that I was, but last weekend's elections in Serbia were also a very, very significant factor in what's going to happen in the next few weeks, and in, I think, defining part of the scope in which the end game of these negotiations, the end game of this process is going to take place. I say all this because, although I'd hope to be incredibly specific and give you all kinds of detail and let you know exactly what happened in the negotiations and why things are the way that they are, I can't. For one thing, some of the most sensitive issues are still very much under negotiation, and there aren't answers to some of these questions. And quite frankly, it would be somewhat inappropriate while the talks are going on for me to, give away each side's negotiating position and what we heard from each side. So I'm going to be a little more oblique than I had hoped, and I'm probably going to speak a little less specifically than I would like. But all's not lost, because what I decided would make sense for me to do instead, because this is something that you really should know about. There aren't that many times in current history, we can go back, a couple of generations and it happened a lot more, where we create new political entities or potentially countries, and that is what's going to be happening with Kosovo in the next very near future. So I want to give you sort of an informed observer's guide to the Kosovo status talks, so you know the antecedents, so that you know the relative background, so that you know the key issues that are on the negotiating table, and that when you pick up that New York Times or that Washington Post or that Economist or whatever it is you find to be your principal news source, and please let it be one of those three. I don't mean it just like that, but you understand what's going on, and you have the background so you can internalize and digest and actually, understand what's happening there. We are hitting a decisive stage. I think I've said that. Now, having said all that, since this is the Balkans, and it is a Balkan issue we're talking about, we've got to start with some history. I apologize in advance for what you are going to think is a rather lengthy historical narrative. But as anyone who's ever worked in or studied or even interacted with folks from the Balkans know, you cannot grasp the Balkan present. You cannot grasp what is going on without having a pretty firm grasp on the historical past. It just won't work. Kosovo. For generations, Kosovo has been a territory that is disputed between ethnic Serbs and ethnic Albanians. It's an important point. I'm just going to say it again. It is a disputed area between Serbs and Albanians. And just as they dispute over today territorial control, their respective historians have a long historical quarrel about Kosovo's history. There is not agreement between the Serb historians and the Kosovo historians about what the actual history of Kosovo is. The Albanians claim they are the original inhabitants of Kosovo, claiming that they are the descendants of the ancient Illyrians. And there are indeed, all kinds of indication of an Illyrian presence in what is today modern Kosovo. Now, the question of whether the Illyrians became the Albanians or not is a little more, I think, under review. And whether or not that would actually necessarily provide justification for total control political of the territory today is also something to be discussed. But that's the Albanian perspective. They are the original inhabitants. They're the descendants of the Illyrians. It's theirs. The Serbs say Kosovo is at the heart of the Serbian nation. It is the heart of medieval Serbia. And that during the Middle Ages, few, if any, Albanians lived there. To buttress their claims, they point to a vast array of churches, monasteries, aspects, monuments, parts of Serbian cultural patrimony. And, Kosovo is Serbia for a number of Serbs. Although we could go a lot farther back in history because this is a 50-minute lecture and I want to do a little bit of Q&A, I'm going to start very shortly with a specific date, June 28th, 1389. And some of you will probably already know what that date means. But that is the day of the famous battle on the field of Kosovo Polje, the field of blackbirds in Kosovo, in which the Serbian prince Lazar took on the invading Ottoman Turks and lost. The importance of that date and the importance of that event to the Serbian nation, you cannot overstate it. I remember when I first started dealing with Serbs negotiating in the Dayton process. And in my very first, and when you are a new, young, wet behind the ears American negotiator, any Serb you will ever negotiate with will sit you down and give you a history lesson. It just happens, and you should listen because you need to know their history and their perspective on their history if you want to understand them. And the very first thing I heard about was, even though we were doing Bosnia and not doing Kosovo at all and not doing even internal Serbia at all, was Battle of Kosovo Polje, 1389, and what it meant. I'm going to turn to this in a minute, but the importance of that date, among other things, is manifest through the extent to which the 600th anniversary of it was used by Slobodan Milosevic in 1989 as a major event to propel himself and to advance his political future within Serbia. Anyway, as a result of this defeat, as a result of this battle in 1389, by about the mid-1400s, all of Serbia, including Kosovo, was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. And slowly but surely, during the Ottoman times in Kosovo, the population balance within Kosovo began to change from a majority Serb area, and I don't think, well, there are some who dispute that, but most, and again, the historical record is hard, but most people believe that the demographics, which are under dispute like anything else related to Kosovo, were, during these Middle Ages, majority Serb, and during the time of the Ottoman Empire, slowly became majority ethnic Albanian. As ethnic Albanians came to Kosovo, which was a much more fertile area than the hostile mountains of Albania proper. All right, I'm now going to, and for those who know the history, I apologize because I know I'm glossing over huge chunks. I'm not, but in terms of historical facts, I want you to know. The next historical fact I want you to know is much later. Just remember, Kosovo, ancient Serb kingdom. Albanians say they were there first. Remember as well that under Ottoman rule, the demographics underwent some sort of a shift in which those who could claim a majority Albanian status, is now, majority Serb status is now a majority Albanian status, although still with a significant population of Serbs. Following the Second World War, and again I just jumped centuries, and the establishment of Tito's Yugoslavia, to a large extent Kosovo was kept on a very tight leash. And it had different statuses at different times under Tito's Yugoslavia. The most significant thing I want to make sure you have in your heads is the 1974 Constitution, which gave Kosovo a unique, a almost unique status. Two regions received the status of autonomous provinces rather than republics within Tito's Yugoslavia. And they were Kosovo and the Vojvodina, and we won't talk about the Vojvodina today, but Kosovo. And what this meant was it had almost all the same rights as Yugoslavia's six republics, say Bosnia, say Serbia, say Slovenia, but not quite. And the legal what it meant was a reasonable sense of self-rule, a reasonable ability to within this Yugoslav federation, following the lead from Belgrade, and of course with the Communist Central Committee calling an awful lot of shots, still have elements of local rule. From that time on, the remaining Serbs in Kosovo began to complain of, and with cause of harassment, intimidation, things from the Albanians, who in turn demanded that Kosovo should have the exact same status as the republics within Yugoslavia. Now, more and more Serbs began to leave. The Serbs were worried as well because of the demographics that you could all see, because of differences in birth rates, because of Serbs' immigration. The trends in Kosovo were becoming even more clear, and the likelihood of it ever being a Serb majority area, was pretty slight. Okay, this gets us to 1989, and the late 80s, and Slobodan Milosevic's rise to power. Most people don't remember, and again, I don't have time to go into this totally, but the way in which Milosevic propelled himself to power within Serbia. He was a powerful guy, but he was a second or third level official working for a much more senior official, or a more senior official, until he was sent at the behest of senior officials to Kosovo to deal with some issues related to Serb complaints about their treatment by ethnic Albanians. And Milosevic, being both a telegeneic guy in the Serbian universe, and he was, and a shrewd Machiavellian politician, which he also definitely was, used this to propel himself onto the front page of the evening news, the front pages of the newspapers, the front pages of everything, and became this symbol of standing up for the Serbian minority, the poor, oppressed, and again, I don't mean this in a disparaging way. It was pretty rough being an ethnic Serb in Kosovo in the late 80s. I won't tell you otherwise. And used this as the real launch to his political career. Now, although the international community really criticized Milosevic for what had happened, because what happened is he suspended the 74 Constitution's provisions for Kosovo, put the Serbs back in charge. The Albanians, in fact, withdrew from most institutions, and for a number of years ran parallel institutions. They didn't send their kids to public schools. They had their own schools in basements. They didn't send their kids. They ran kind of a parallel government on their own informally. And although Milosevic was strongly criticized for this, and this became an issue, Kosovo quickly became, I think, for the international community, a lesser priority than the atrocities that were going on in Bosnia and in Croatia. Now, as an American diplomat at this point who was working on these issues at that time, I saw a lot of American officials go into meetings with Milosevic, go into meetings less with Tudjman, because this wasn't a conversation we had with the president of Croatia at the time, although he was aware of what we're doing, but even within the Dayton process, and tell the Serbs as well, you got to solve your Kosovo problem. You cannot do the things you're doing, which have taken away some of the constitutional rights to one of your minority populations. But although Kosovo was always on that list, it just simply, during the times in which we're trying to deal particularly with Bosnia, it just didn't get the same amount of attention or detail, and it wasn't as much of a powder keg. So it kind of just sat there in stasis until 1998, when two things happened. First of all, we had achieved, and I will put in quotation marks, well, I won't put in quotation marks, success. We had achieved, now I will put in quotation marks, peace in Bosnia, which allowed us more focus more directly on Kosovo. People weren't killing other people because of their ethnicity in large organized ways anymore. We still had our challenges, we still do. But it was a different set of issues, and it required a different level of attention. So the international community, which quite frankly has a hard time digesting more than 2 or 3 crises, particularly in one region at a time, was able to actually digest a little more Kosovo. Secondly, the Kosovar Albanians began to get more and more impatient with the status quo. So, like any sort of good freedom-loving group of people, they organized themselves, particularly the men who could, organize themselves to project lethal force, and created or organized themselves better, because we don't quite know exactly when it was created, but had a paramilitary force that began to take on Serb forces, either army or police. And there were military operations in reply. And not surprisingly, anybody who studied the Balkans knows, Milosevic's reaction was less than gentle, And you had over the course of the summer of 1998 open conflict between the Serbian military and the Serbian Ministry of Interior Forces, which, we call police in English, but they're really not that. They're not quite military, but they're also not sort of your policeman patrolling your street. And these sort of paramilitary ethnic Albanian forces. By the middle of the summer to late summer, you had a situation where you had about 1,500 Kosovar Albanians dead, 400,000 people who had to flee their homes because of what was going on. And Kosovo became a major international issue due to concerns of the international community for escalating violence, humanitarian consequences, and the risks of it spreading. Because remember, there's ethnic Albanians in places beyond Kosovo and we'll get to that in a minute too. Now, we had a long series of international community efforts to deal with this in the course of the summer and the fall of 1998. And again, time precludes me from going through sordid detail as part of a lot of these. But they culminated in these peace talks in a place called Rambouillet, a French chalet, not too far from Paris, where we had a round of talks between the Serbs and the ethnic Albanians from the 6th to the 23rd of February. And then we took a pause because we had an agreement that neither side was totally prepared to agree to or sign. It would have left the Albanians, we'll come back to this in a minute too, wanted independence. The agreement did not give them independence, but gave them a full autonomous status within Serbia. We went back to Paris and to the Kleber Center, which is, by the way, where the Vietnam peace talks also took place, right downtown Paris, for a week in the middle of March. And the outcome of all that was the Kosovo Albanian delegation reluctantly agreed to the peace agreement, and the Serb side did not. And the talks broke up without an agreement on the question of Kosovo. Immediately thereafter, there was a major military build-up offensive within Serbia. At the same time, the U.S. and Germany and France and others had been saying one of the threats to the Serbs is if you do not go along, if you do not accede to a reasonable settlement, we may use force against you. And so in reaction to that, when these talks breaking down and the Serbian military and police forces ramping up the intensity of their operations against civilian populations in Kosovo, a decision was taken on March 23rd for NATO to commence airstrikes against Serbia. I think most of us remember that. I certainly do. Remember it very well. And it's rather ironic, as a guy who's also spent a large part of his career working on NATO issues, that the first real use of NATO use of projection of lethal force, notwithstanding all the plans throughout the Cold War of how you would take on the Warsaw Pact on the central plains of Germany, was aerial attacks against Serbia and Serb military and Ministry of Interior positions within Kosovo and elsewhere. Okay, we get to 10 June 1999, 77 days later. There's eventually a ceasefire and an end to the NATO airstrikes on Kosovo as a result of a deal brokered by one Marti Ahtisaari, among others, who we'll turn to in a minute. NATO suspended its air operations after it was confirmed that the Serbs were complying with this deal and had withdrawn all their security forces from Kosovo. Very shortly thereafter, the UN passed a resolution in the Security Council, Resolution 1244, which remains the Security Council resolution which governs the current status of Kosovo. That resolution was to be the legal framework for Kosovo's status post the failure of the Rambouillet peace talks, post the NATO airstrikes, and post the initial ceasefire agreement with a military annex signed between NATO and the Serbian forces. What the UN decided to do was put Kosovo under a UN, and I will put in quotes here, interim civilian administration. So the UN was given authority to govern Kosovo and also I'm quoting from the resolution here, facilitate a political process to determine Kosovo's future status. Again, this is 1999. Kosovo remains to this day under UN interim civilian administration. And Kosovo's final status to this day has still not been defined as called for in Resolution 1244. There remains a robust, part of the agreement as well was you would have a robust NATO force there which would guarantee, provide security. It's not as large as it was in 1999 and 2000, but there's still, I think, over 7,000 NATO forces, including a number of Americans, in Kosovo helping provide security for that region. The early days of the UN administration were basically just trying to govern a territory that was almost ungovernable for a while. As they got themselves more organized and as they were more effective in the civilian governance of Kosovo, they eventually took decisions to allow for the Kosovars themselves, rather than the UN, to be more and more responsible for day-to-day governance. And so they created, an interim administration. They established a policy, what was called then standards before status. The UN defined things we would want to see those responsible for Kosovo doing. And on that basis, once those standards were fulfilled, we would then go to a question of Kosovo's status. All right? That's where we sat for a number of years again. As the situation in Kosovo became more stable, attention turned elsewhere. There are lots of other issues in the world. And quite frankly, a lot of countries paying attention to Kosovo knew just how hard the actual talk about status and the actual negotiations on status would be. Because throughout all this, the Kosovo Albanians have insisted Kosovo must be independent. There is no other status that is acceptable to the people of Kosovo. That is the Kosovo Albanian position. Was, is, and will be. The Serbian position is every bit as clear. Every bit as clear. Kosovo is part of Serbia's heritage. Kosovo is Serbian. These Albanians are in the majority now. And we have no problem with them having any type of an autonomous status they can think of, but it cannot become independent from Serbia. And that has been their position, thoroughly, frequently, and loudly stated for years, and not just in this most recent process. So, looking at these negotiations, as long as you have a status quo that's reasonably stable, why mess with it? And so that is I say that somewhat facetiously, but that is what happened, I think, in the early half of this decade. There are other issues out there. This is a really thorny issue, and it seems to be working. The UN's governing it. Two problems with this. One, we, the international community, are devoting an awful lot of resources to Kosovo that could be better used elsewhere potentially. I don't have to tell you about some of the joys of my job when I was running the NATO desk of trying to deal with my Pentagon colleagues who wanted all those American soldiers or all those NATO forces that are doing Kosovo being available for other missions that the administration felt might be a higher priority. The last few years have been somewhat bruising for an interagency in that regard. Secondly, neither side's totally happy with an inchoate status quo. And particularly the Kosovo Albanians again began to get impatient. And all this was brought painfully to a head in the spring of 2004. When this is one of those sort of, it could have been this situation, it could have been that situation. But what happened was there were 3 Kosovo Albanian youth who, and nobody quite knows what happened, but somehow got in some kind of an altercation, we think, and it is claimed that they were chased by a bunch of Serbs. To escape the Serbs who were chasing them, they all jumped into the Neretva River and they drowned. This was on the front pages of all of Kosovo's papers the next day, and the Kosovo Albanian population snapped. And what happened in March 2004 was Kosovo Albanians protested by massing against the Serbian populations that were still in Kosovo. Thousands of Serbs had their homes destroyed. A large number of Serbian Orthodox churches were destroyed or damaged or burned, or artifacts were destroyed. At least 28 people were killed. At least 600 were injured. We don't really have all the numbers. But they went on a rampage. And the Kosovo Albanian leadership, to their credit, appealed to the people for calm and saying, knock this off. This long term, this does not help our cause. But the population and some of the rabble-rousers among them who were just impatient wanted this over, and they used this situation as an opportunity to make the Serbs feel even less welcome than they previously felt in Kosovo. Okay? To those of us working on the Balkans, it became clear, okay, the status quo is just, we've been saying for a while it's not tenable. Now we've got our empirical evidence of that. Let's move on. But this being the international community and this being the Americans working with the Europeans, it went through its own plotting process to get from point A to point B. And so the plotting process in this regard was the UN appointed a special envoy, a good friend of mine, Norwegian ambassador to NATO, Kai Eide, who was tasked by the Secretary General of the UN to do a review of the situation in Kosovo, including the extent to which the interim government of Kosovo, the Kosovars who had these positions under UN supervision, were fulfilling the standards the UN had set, and to make a recommendation as to whether or not it was time to talk about Kosovo status. In October of 2005, Ambassador Eide gave his report, and it's a very lengthy report and a very good reading if you're into this kind of thing. It is. It's the best factual sort of report of the actual situation in Kosovo. He did a very thorough, very, very professional job, I think. But his bottom line conclusion was, although standards implementation has been, surprise, uneven, further progress on standards implementation, further progress on making Kosovo more and more and more a democratic place that behaves like a Western democratic regime, is probably not going to happen until the status question is resolved. And so he recommended negotiations on Kosovo status begin. The Security Council took this report, looked at it on October 24, 2005. They endorsed it. And in light speed by UN standards, very shortly thereafter, former Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari was appointed by the UN Secretary General to be his special envoy to lead negotiations and to lead the process on Kosovo status. This was all just 15 months ago. He made his first trips within a couple weeks. Very shortly afterwards, Secretary Rice appointed a very senior American official, former Ambassador Frank Wisner, to be her special representative to these status talks, and I was plucked out of my job and sent to go be the U.S. liaison officer on Martti Ahtisaari's staff. And so I was the lone American sitting on this UN international team that was running the Kosovo status negotiations, January through June of this last year. So, talk about the negotiations for just a minute. From the very first visits to Belgrade and to Pristina, it became clear to all of us that we couldn't begin the negotiations on Kosovo status by talking about Kosovo status, because we knew both sides' positions real well, and like I said, both sides made abundantly clear that they felt no incentive or no desire to compromise remotely on the question of should Kosovo be independent or should it not be. So we decided we would start with a series of issues that would have to be addressed, but that would be what we would call status neutral. Issues that are going to have to be contained in a settlement package, whether Kosovo is independent or whether it is more than autonomous, less than independent, which was at that point the Serbian government's proposal. Although when they actually gave us their proposal, it looked to me like fairly less than autonomous, less than independent, but that's a separate thing. It was a starting position in negotiation. That's not surprising that they started, with a little less than what they could ultimately accept. So we started with a series of issues that would have to be addressed. The first one, and although it seems esoteric, is critical to whether or not Kosovo will function, and function with our collective goal, which is a multi-ethnic society in which all members of all ethnicities feel like they can live in peace and security in Kosovo. Now, that seems pretty obvious and logical to all of us, but that's a pretty high goal in the Balkans. So we talked about the nature and functions of local government. What is a municipality responsible for? Who decides how the budget's spent? Who's responsible for the educational system? How is the money allocated and by whom? Under what criteria? The protection of Kosovo's cultural heritage and religious sites. Will there be special protection and protection regimes for these glorious Serb Orthodox monasteries and churches, and they are amazing. If you ever get a chance to go to Kosovo, you must go see these things. It is world heritage. It truly is. And it far transcends whatever ethnicities in Kosovo now. I mean, truly. And we could not have a settlement that doesn't have a concrete, specific, and credible and functioning package of protections for that, or else we would totally fail. The question of what sorts of protections would exist for Kosovo's non-Albanian communities. And there are some besides the Serbs as well who began to make their voices heard. Who knew there were Gorani and Egyptians in Kosovo? Well, they let us know because they wanted protections too, and they claim to need them. And actually, I don't doubt them when they talk to us about them. But if you're a Serb and the Kosovo Parliament, because at this point the population it keeps changing, the Serbs right now in Kosovo maybe make up 8 to 10% of the population, probably less. If all the Serbs who fled Kosovo came back, it would be higher. And again, even those numbers are totally disputable. It may be more, it may be less. We simply don't know because we don't have a census. But even if they're 20% or 30%, and they're not, but if you got all the Serbs who returned, they perhaps could be, that means they would only have 20 to 30% of the seats in the parliament. So what happens if the parliament wants to pass a law that goes directly against the interests of the Serbian population within Kosovo? What kind of protections do you have? Do you have a double majority voting system within the parliament so that if somebody wants to rename the main boulevard downtown Pristina after a person who's particularly odious to the Serbs, that the Serbs in parliament can stop that? Suppose somebody wants to pass a law that starts taxing certain churches' properties. Because there would have been there'd probably be support amongst a lot of the Albanians within the Kosovo Parliament to do that. Can the Serbs stop that? If there are only 20 to 30% of the seats in Parliament, and under the first round of elections, there would probably be less. So what types of legal and institutional protections are in place so the Serbian population in Kosovo and the other communities in Kosovo can protect their interests? Finally, there's a wide range of economic issues. If Kosovo is even more than autonomous, less than independent, what does that mean for the payment of the foreign debt that Serbia is currently servicing that deals with infrastructure projects and things in Kosovo? And what does it mean about who owns what factory where? Because remember, a lot of this stuff was state-owned. This is Yugoslavia. Is it privatized? How is it privatized? Who gets the proceeds? Does some of it go to Serbia? Because the Serbs would argue, look, it wasn't Kosovo that built this giant factory. It was Yugoslavia, and the Serbian Republic paid. I go on and on, but there's money here. These are hard issues. And whether Kosovo is independent or not, they've got to be negotiated. So we hosted a long series of meetings on all these things, or we tried. They were ultimately rather frustrating. Because although we were able to identify the issues, and although we were able to get positions from the two sides about where they came out on these things, our ability to take side A and side B and get them here just simply, there wasn't an incentive to come to closure on any of these issues. We narrowed differences, and we identified our best sense of a way forward, which was not totally acceptable to either side. But we never got, on any issue, both sides coming together saying, we both agree this is the way forward on this particular issue. Just don't have it. Furthermore, both sides were negotiating from very different positions with different incentives. The Kosovo Albanian side, primary incentive was to demonstrate their readiness for an independent Kosovo. So that what they wanted to do is put on the table what they considered to be far-reaching proposals that would establish a regime that met all the highest standards of protection, national communities, and all the rest. And although commendable as an incentive, some of the proposals fell short. Some had fantastic general language, but when you looked at how they were going to implement these commitments, you got blank looks back, like, oh, I don't know. I mean, we'll create a committee to do it. Well, that's not reassuring to the Serbs, nor to us. Now, to their credit, when we identified areas for further elaboration, areas for improvement, or whatever, they took us seriously, and they generally were prepared to review and revise. But it's been this iterative process in which the Kosovo Albanians were negotiating more with Mr. Adasari and his team on their proposals as we fine-tuned them than with the Serbs. So we got them from here to there, But no. Meanwhile, the Serb side, the Serb position was and is still about something very different. The Serb position is about maintaining Kosovo's status within Serbia. The Serb position is not agreeing to anything which would result in an independent Kosovo, and not agreeing to anything which would be a slippery slope to that. So with them, we got bogged down, and again, I understand it, and I understand their negotiating position. We got bogged down on such exciting issues as whether a Kosovo municipal government could have a private bank account or whether they're required to have all their funds in the Serbian National Bank. Hours on that issue. Whether or not the government of Serbia could continue to maintain, this is an important issue, but whether or not the government of Serbia could continue to maintain and pay for teachers and teachers' salaries and hire teachers and all the rest for schools in Kosovo. Whether or not doctors in the health system, what's the status of the hospital in Mitrovica? What's the status of the university in Mitrovica? Mitrovica, by the way, being a Serb-majority city in the northern part of Kosovo. But it was all about not agreeing to anything, which would be a slippery slope or a symbol of any lessening of Serbian sovereignty over Kosovo. All right. By late spring, both sides were also complaining that we probably weren't not going to be able to make much more progress without a discussion of status itself. So there was one. It was in mid-July. President Ahtisaari hosted it. It was an important meeting to have had. But again, there was no change in positions. The Serbian president and prime minister laid out their view. The Kosovar president and prime minister laid out their view, and Mr. Ahtisaari sagely nodded his head. Thank you very much. I've heard you both now. I'm going to internalize this and digest this, and we'll get back to you with our suggestions at some point on the way forward. Now, two more things I want to say. My time's up. The role of the international community. I don't want you to walk away with the impression that this has all been Mr. Ahtisaari and his team with the Albanians and with the Kosovar Albanians and the Serbs, and no other actors in this melodrama. There's lots of other actors in this melodrama. There are lots of interested players in the international community who are playing an essential role in the process and will have an essential role to play in the implementation of whatever emerges from this, and have been playing an essential role in the status quo so far. So there's the contact group, which is this informal, and I put that in quotes now, group of the United States, France, Germany, the UK, Italy, Russia, and some of the key international organizations, the UN, the EU, the OSCE sometimes, NATO for sure. Different countries have different interests. Everybody's interested, though, in seeing this process move forward. Prior to the start of the negotiations, the contact group gave a statement in which they laid out what they thought would be key principles that must be met in any settlement to this thing. I don't have time to spell them all out, although they're available on the Mr. Ahtisaari's office's website, UNOSEC, www.unosek.org. But among them were clear protections and safeguards for all of Kosovo's ethnic communities, strengthening regional stability. After the talks began, the contact group held another meeting early on, in which they also added to that list that the outcome had to be acceptable to the people of Kosovo. And different members of the contact group interpreted that in different ways. Because obviously, I don't know if it's acceptable to the majority population of Kosovo, it's probably not going to be acceptable to Serbs. It's acceptable to the Serbs in Kosovo, may not be acceptable to, But that was one of the criteria laid out. The contact group is meeting this week, on Friday, at the ministerial level, again, it would appear, to talk to Mr. Ahtisaari about the next step. And that's who I want to talk about next. We took a break. I moved on to something else in July or August and was replaced by somebody else. But the process took a pause in the negotiations when the Serbian government announced it would be holding elections, which now just took place this last weekend. It was not in anybody's interest for there to be live negotiations on Kosovo status in the middle of a Serbian election campaign, for what I would assume are fairly obvious reasons. So Mr. Ahtisaari announced that he would take a pause, but he also announced that very shortly after those elections he would meet with the parties and he would present his proposal of a way forward. That's going to be happening fairly soon. Different newspapers report this happening on different days, but sometimes in the next few weeks it will be public. And once he's given the paper to his proposals to both sides, they will be leaked to the press. We hope not, but everything else has been, so this won't be any different. And they will be out there in the public sphere. Here are the things you should look for in my remaining 4 minutes as you look at what's going on in the press and the questions you should ask yourself. Here's what to look for. Detailed provisions. What does the document say about municipal governments and their authorities? Because, again, this is key. If the Serbian people feel like, within their little municipality at least, they can control the school system and the health system and the budget and all the rest, they might feel more assured than if they have to rely on those, from their perspective, yahoos, who run the parliament who aren't of their ethnicity. What are the constitutional provisions and mechanisms and protective arrangements for the non-Albanian communities in Kosovo, with particular emphasis on the Serbs? Is there a qualified majority within the parliament for passage of legislation on issues of vital interest to other communities? What types of protections in place? If something is happening that another community doesn't like, what are the mechanisms for them to take it to the court? Is it an Albanian judge always? What do the provisions say about the establishment and conditions for any security force? Will Kosovo have an army? Will it have something else? Will there be organized guys in uniforms with the ability to project lethal force? What will they be called? Under whose control will they be? Protection of religious sites and provisions for protection and maintenance of cultural heritage. What arrangements are in place for these churches and monasteries and other things, not just religious sites, which are also essential to the core of the Serbian nation. Debt and assets, we talked about it. How does it work? Is there a division of debt and assets, and how? The role of the international community. Who implements this thing? What's the international community's role in a post-status Kosovo? Is it still an interim civilian administration that the international is responsible for? Probably not. Probably going to be locals who actually are running the government. Are they supervised in some way? By whom? How? Do those internationals have veto power over what they do? How does it work? Finally, and this is going to be the most fun to watch, how is the international community responding to Ahtisaari's proposals? I mean, first of all, what is the Albanian and the Serbian reaction? And if he's done his job right, neither side is going to be totally happy. But for this thing to become legitimate, there's got to be a reasonable sense of coherence within the international community to see it implemented. Are there divisions within the contact group? Do all the members of the contact group speak with the same voice about this thing? When it goes to New York for debate, how does that go? Who is taking what position on what provision? It won't surprise you to learn that the Kosovo Albanians are telling the world that the Americans will be with them no matter what, and the Serbs are telling the world that the Russians will be with them no matter what. The truth is, neither of those statements are accurate. But I would also say that it's going to be hard if the two sides don't both say we can't stand this thing, but we'll accept it as the basis. If one of the two sides doesn't say that, if one of the sides just rejects it outright, and the Serbs may, it's going to make that Security Council conversation about do we go forward with this anyway a lot more difficult. The Russians, the Chinese, and others have real legitimate concerns about the precedent of taking a decision about a country's territory absent the support of that country. At the same time, you could argue that Kosovo is a very unique case. It's been under UN administration now for 8 years. It's not the same as some other places. So these are all live issues coming your way. I recognize I'm ending this speech on a slightly unsatisfactory note. I've given you a lot of questions, given you a lot to think about, and I've not given you a lot of answers. Take that as yet another indication this is a truly Balkan issue. Thank you. All right. This took longer than I thought just to actually get through my presentation. I know some people have to go. I'm happy to take questions for those who want to stay or are interested, or if you want to go, I promise I won't be offended. So, but if there are questions, I think we have a microphone, so.
I was just wondering if Albania is playing an active role in all of this and what their role is.
The Albanian role, I mean the government of Albania, they are not playing an active role, and that is by choice. Two things to know there. One, I mean they're deeply interested, as any other neighboring country is, and they obviously have close ties to the Kosovo Albanian leadership. But their bottom line has been, they told Ahtisaari they wanted to be incredibly interested observers. I was a little skeptical they'd be able to hold themselves to that, but up until now they generally, from our perspective, have. They've given good advice to the Kosovo Albanians not to freak out too much when something happens in the negotiations that don't go their way. They've been a reasonably moderating influence on them, and they've been reasonably understated in public about the process. But it's also no secret what the Albanian government's proposed desired outcome of this process might be. But generally, they've been constructive.
I just had a question. Could you speak a little bit about what role the KLA's ties to Al Qaeda played in the negotiations, if any?
None. I mean, within the negotiations, none. I mean, you know, the question of the Kosovo Liberation Army, which is the largest but not the only of those paramilitary groups that were organized, the question of their relationship with Islamic extremists or Islamic extremist terrorist organizations is something that's been out there for a very long time. As a U.S. government official, you know, all I can say is, having read all the various things out there, as far as I know, no one's ever been able to conclusively demonstrate a clear relationship. In the negotiations, the KLA hasn't played. There are people who used to be affiliated with the KLA who were part of the Kosovo or Albania negotiation team. There are also people who used to be affiliated with KLA who are doing everything possible to undermine this process and are claiming that those negotiating are selling out Kosovo by deigning to talk to the Serbs and the internationals about this, that the outcome is obvious and that Kosovo should be independent and, if necessary, it will be done by force. And there are some very unpleasant people in Kosovo who are, trying to use force as a means to achieve political objectives. Right now, less so, because the process is going on. But the actual link to Al-Qaeda, it hasn't had any impact on the negotiations, if there is one.
You've indicated that religion is a factor in the area.
Oh, yes.
You spent some time in Albania. You understand the LDS Church has a mission there, and contrary to our policy in other areas, they are proselyting Muslims. Yes. Any observation on that?
I guess what I'd say, I don't know if I have an observation on that specific point, but it is an indication of a larger point that is important for people, I think, who study the Balkans, and that is that the Muslims of the former Yugoslavia are a very different group of Muslims. I mean, there are many different groups of Muslims, but the Muslim communities of the former Yugoslavia, and in this regard I would include Albania, although they're not part of the former Yugoslavia as well, at least in Albania proper, but are much more secular and a much less sort of radical, I don't know the word isn't necessarily radicalized, but more Western in orientation than some of the other Islamic groups that you will encounter. So it's not a surprise to me that there's a Mormon mission established in Tirana and that missionaries proselytize in Albania. One little story, again, in the Kosovo negotiations, one of the issues was, will there be a law on religion? This is important to the Serbs. What will the law on religion say? Will they follow some of the models out there? There's only 3 or 4 or 5 faiths, and you have to be a member of one of those 5s, and no other churches are allowed in the country. That was one of the proposals. And in fact, I remember sitting down with the Kosovo Albanians on this, because we were working on this issue with the Council of Europe. We wanted ahead of time, passed before the negotiations ended, already enshrined in legislation, a new law on religions, a new law on a few other things as well. And they were working with the Council of Europe and people on the UN team, and they plopped the law on religions in front of me. And there was, from my perspective, a problem in that you could be Orthodox, you could be Muslim, you could be Catholic, you could be but you couldn't be Mormon, you couldn't be Jehovah's. I mean, they weren't on the list. And so those churches were not going to be allowed in Kosovo under the legislation. And I just looked at the lead Kosovo negotiator and said, this is your law. And he said, that's my law. And before I could say something else, he said, but I know you won't like it. How strongly are you going to feel? And I said, I'm going to feel pretty strongly. He said, well, here's another law. And he was just testing, because it was going to be easier to get that passed. Because actually this was an area where the Serbian Orthodox Church was perfectly happy as well with legislation that would not necessarily have other faiths beyond the traditional faiths in Kosovo. Now, I will also say in the new law that eventually got through, there aren't restrictions on there isn't a list of only these churches are allowed in Kosovo. So ultimately, depending on how the process goes, and depending on our opening of missions in other parts of the former Yugoslavia, because remember we had missionaries in Serbia for quite a while too, and they may be, but we have couples. I don't know if we have elders and sisters back, but we probably do. We didn't for a while because I was involved in getting them out of there during the airstrikes. Kosovo's out there. So,
you sort of persuaded me that the status question actually will not be resolved. That there is no way to resolve it in the short term. I'm wondering, can the various parties live with that? And is it possible to make progress on some of those other issues you're talking about, municipalities, security, and so forth, without resolving the status question?
I don't think so. And I think the status question is going to resolve itself, but it may not necessarily be pretty. Because from the Serbian perspective, the status quo is, although unpleasant, more acceptable than the likely alternatives. But from the Kosovo Albanian perspective, I think we have almost reached the point where the market's not going to bear much more status quo, and that more and more people will be taking issues in their own hands. And also, I have to say, the UN and Adisari and others, including the U.S. government, are committed to this process resolving itself one way or another. But we'll see. The next few months are going to be pretty interesting, difficult, challenging. But, the EU had their meeting of foreign ministers on Monday, immediately after Serbian elections. It was all about Kosovo. It was all about the outcome of the Serbian elections and what it means for the Kosovo process and for Serbia's future. where there are different ways of interpreting the Serbian election results, by the way, as well. The bad way is the party that we probably have the most concerns about, which would most deviate Serbia from its path towards NATO and the EU and European integration, won 28% of the vote. The radicals, Vojislav Šešelj, he's sitting in The Hague, but the guy who's the standard bearer for the party, they got the most votes than anybody else, the plurality, 28%. But another way of interpreting is the Democratic parties collectively, because these guys just can't, they got to have their party. But if you add their sum up together, they got they got a majority of votes. Serbia's government they're now beginning in the next few days a process of incredibly difficult negotiations on forming a government. It'll be interesting to see what comes out. Most observers think that the Democratic forces will form another government, although it will be an inherently problematic government in some ways because there's just so many different divisions and fissures within it. But within all that, this Kosovo process could also could upend all that. And then again, there's the resources we're committing, including soldiers, which are needed elsewhere. So it will get done. Anyway.
You're saying that the common belief is that the Russians will back the Serbs and that America will back Albanians. But you said it's not necessarily true. But what's the basic American interest? It kind of seems like America is still more on the side of the Kosovo Albanians. What started that, especially with the Albanians being Muslim, and what kind of implications does that have on the other Muslim communities and everything like that?
Yeah, I would cast it a different way. Because what you're laying out is conventional wisdom, particularly in Serbia. But I would cast it a different way. The American interest isn't that the Albanians win and the Serbs lose. On the contrary, the American interest is most definitely not that. The American interest is a settlement to this situation which results in, I think, three different things. One, a more stable neighborhood. The last 15, 20 years, an unstable Balkans is not happy for the United States. Not happy for a lot of our partners either, but not happy for the United States. So a more stable neighborhood, one. Two, an outcome that regardless of how it comes out, people of all ethnicities, regardless of what they are able to make individual choices about where they will live and under what conditions, and feel like they can do that in conditions of security. Now, that is a tall order in Kosovo, and it may be an idealistic order, but we have to try, because those are our values, and they are the West values, and they are Serbia's values. I'd say the last interest, though, is as well, if you look at the geography of the Balkans, you look at who's where and what and how. Serbia is a critical player. Serbia is the center of all that, and we have had historically very good relations with Serbia. We continue to both seek, want, and work for close relations with Serbia. But but we also can't. What's the word I want? We can't stint on the terms for those. Serbia has to actually meet the standards of the West. So that's why we insist on such things as turning over people who are responsible for war crimes to the Hague Tribunal. It's why we insist that on the case of Kosovo, that they look carefully at the Kosovo Albanians' perspective, which is, if you look at the history, the Kosovo Albanians have a pretty good reason not to feel very confident in continuing to live within a Serbian state. So you put all that together, where do we come out? It's hard to say, because you have competing your interests result in sort of competing a sense of what's the best way forward. We're going to look, I will now say, speaking like an American official, we're going to look very closely with what Mr. Adesari puts on the table. I think from our perspective, I think, and I'm not going to show any leg on the American outcome because, nobody in my government has, and far be it from me to do it first. But I think my personal view is an unstable Kosovo, and a Kosovo within Serbia will continue to be very unstable, is a real challenge to security and stability in that region.